Okay, thank you, Jean. It's indeed my pleasure to be on this panel. So, to speak directly to your question, for us is more from an economic perspective. It's really about the economics, right? If you look at it critically, service apartments, apartment developments generally, it's really down to economies of scale. Because when you build multiple units, when you're able to harness the land, right, and build multiple units within regulation, please, let's note, within regulation, then you're able to actually drive the value of that development itself. And what you can do ultimately with that is, even in terms of providing affordable housing to the end users and investors, what you start to realize is, by virtue of economies of scale, a property which you would have put, say, 4 units of townhouses on, you're able to incorporate as many as 20, 24, 30 units, right? And what that does is the immediate cost of the land is ultimately transferred to the investors and is spread across multiple players. Even the cost of maintaining, operating the facility from a development standpoint starts to drop, right? And to sort of take cues from your question to Vivian as well, from a demand perspective, in our environment right now, in our country, Nigeria especially, the larger population, the dominant population is actually below 30. And when you look at the current living conditions for people within that age bracket, they truly do not need more than a serviced apartment. And if you're able to create a sustainable brand, right, like you said, if you create a sustainable brand or you create a branded apartment development, which you would mostly find a lot of in cities like Nairobi or in Dubai or in Rwanda, you'd realize that you can drive extreme value with that. You can drive extreme value with that, you know? So for us as an organization, we've tried to create similar developments, one of which which I'm sure is the one you or other co-panelists must have heard of. It's called Boardroom Apartments. And what we try to do with that development is, post-COVID, we realized that end-to-end living, 360-degree lifestyle now became the in thing. People wanted to be able to live, work, and relax within the same facility. So what we've done with a development like that, which you'll find is our template, is we've tried to incorporate as many lifestyle features, recreational amenities, hospitality. So we have a hotel, we have short-let apartments, there's a spa, there's a restaurant, and all of this is developed on a property that's not larger than 1,500 square meters. And it's not cramped up because we also did not try to over-maximize the land. And what we realized with that development is the return on it is significantly greater than if we had just built conventional homes, townhouses, because it is actually meeting the immediate demand of the young populace and the immediate demand of the economy right now when you look at the real estate development landscape. So, thanks.
What is your experience and how do you manage that the effect on your margins?
Okay, that's a brilliant question actually, because that's the reality that we find ourselves in as real estate developers and practitioners. I would speak to your question in 2 forms or in 2 phases. I'll speak from an execution standpoint and I'll speak from an investment and strategy standpoint. Execution-wise, one of the first things we did, it was almost like we had a crystal ball. About 18 months ago, when we were going to start one of our major projects that was going to require a huge capital investment, one of the decisions we took as management and as a board at the time was to go into the market to raise debt finance at a reasonable interest rate, right? I use reasonable because that's relative, but I use reasonable carefully. At the time, we raised that fund, and the first thing I did with it, this was 18 months ago, was to go into the market and acquire literally all my finished items. We hadn't laid one brick on site. We paid for our kitchens, we paid for our lifts, we paid for our tiles, we paid for so many finishes. And it was almost as if my CFO at the time, brilliant guy, as if he anticipated that something was going to go wrong, because he literally just said, we need to buy as many things as possible. First of all, I've realized that from that one experience, it has resulted in a change in how we look at projects internally as an organization. That same model we've carried into multiple projects, and for my other developer colleagues and friends, it's something I think really needs to be considered, because you can't really control these things. It's an economic factor that we literally do not have any control over, and it's something that is a reality that would continuously happen. The recession happened over a decade ago. It happened more than 30, 40 years ago. It would continuously happen. So your ability to sort of manage that is critical. So that's the first step we took. The second step, from our business model, we've built ourselves as an ecosystem, and it's very deliberate, because we don't see ourselves as an organization that can function in isolation of different strategic partners. There are different companies participating in this summit today that we have different strategic partnerships with. Some we've even invested in, such as Split, right? And it's because end to end, we've tried to identify what are those businesses that are fundamental to real estate development from an execution standpoint and from an operation standpoint. And we've tried to take strategic positioning in most of those companies, either as partners or as investors. And what that does ultimately for an organization such as ours is we're able to get better bargains on a lot of things. We're able to lock in rates even before the projects start. We're able to get significant discounts from some of our partners because we have a long-standing relationship with them. And that same discount, like you rightfully mentioned, we can't necessarily transfer the increased cost to our off-takers or our investors, but we can transfer those discounts to them when situations like the inflation come to play, right, or come to bear. So that's from an execution standpoint. From an investment standpoint, same thing. There are two things. The first thing is to always look at, in a situation like this, is to look at investing more in opportunistic transactions, right? And what I mean by opportunistic transactions is, in some instances you have joint ventures, in some instances you have brownfield developments. For brownfield developments, what you really need to consider is the fact that when inflation is at an all-time high, like what we have right now, the cost of replacement is significantly high. And if you are able to acquire a building regardless of its current state, albeit dilapidated, the amount of money or capital you need to invest or inject to bring that project to life is significantly different from if you were going to start building from scratch. And if you look at most other developed countries, it's not everyone that starts building from scratch. I think in our environment, we need to cultivate the habit of restoring buildings. We have one or two projects like that we're currently on, right? And I can tell you for free that the cost difference, if we're going to rebuild from scratch, and right now that we're restoring and renovating, and is almost 100-200% more. So we need to sort of think about our investment strategy from a different perspective, And I think lastly, the thing I would mention as well is leverage isn't bad. Too much leverage is bad. The challenge a lot of developers have in our space is our exposure sometimes far outweighs the amount of properties we're even able to deliver. So we start so many projects, the portfolio looks robust, but then your leverage, when you look at your debt profile or your debt ratio, is all over the place. If you look for different finance houses, banks, financial institutions, there are a number of them that are still willing to support real estate. I mean, the CEO of NMRC was here a few minutes ago and he said the same thing. If you're able to collaborate appropriately and you're able to go into these strategic partnerships, you'd realize that there's no one that doesn't want the real estate industry to grow. Because guess what? We all need houses, we all need homes. Residential development in comparison to commercial development will always be in demand, because regardless of what inflation, the economy, recession that we may be in as a nation, housing would always be a fundamental human need that people would always channel their money to. So that's the simple strategy for us from an execution standpoint and from an investment standpoint. Thank you.